Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isolde Sommer. Can you hear me? Yeah. And I'd like to welcome you all to the Method Seminar today. These seminars are organized between the Danube University Krems here in Austria, the Shep Center for Health Services Research at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and RTI International, which is headquartered in Raleigh, North Carolina. And of course, we welcome individuals from other organizations to attend. Before I introduce today's presenter, I'd like to remind everyone that we are all tuned in using phones or headsets. If you want to answer your phone or speak with somebody or it gets loud where you are, then please mute your microphone so you don't disturb the entire group. I'd also like to remind everyone that we record these method seminars and publish them as slidcasts on our website. However, we do not record the discussion afterwards. Okay, so today's seminar will be given by Dr. Meera Viswanathan from RTI. Dr. Viswanathan is a health services researcher focusing on systematic reviews. She directs the RTI International University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Evidence-Based Practice Center. In addition to leading or supporting numerous reviews, she has worked extensively on methods to refine and add rigor to systematic reviews. She has led or participated in the development of tools and guidance to assess the risk of bias of observational studies and systematic reviews. She has developed guidance on evaluating conflicts of interest from non-financial sources and on conducting reviews of complex intervention. Thank you so much for being with us today, Meera. I know we're all looking forward to this presentation. I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julia. And are you able to hear me? Julia?
Hello?
Are you able to hear okay?
There seems to be a little bit of an echo. It's we can't hear you as clearly as before.
I've tried to turn down the volume a bit, but that helps. No? Julia?
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Is it better or should I dial it on the phone line?
It's not really better at all.
Okay, well let me try it. I'm sorry.
Oh, this is so fantastic. I think Meera's just going to log in again. Hopefully it will work better then.
Hi, is this better?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, all right. Sorry. We had actually tried this before and it worked fine. So we'll just try this other approach. So thank you everybody for joining this method seminar. So I wanted to start by saying, this is an introduction to the ACROBAT NRS, which is the Cochrane risk of bias assessment tool for non-randomized studies of interventions. I'm presenting today, but I wanted to make the point that the slides today come from Julian Higgins and Jonathan Stern. They, along with Bonnie Reeves and others at the University of Bristol, are really instrumental in having led the development of this tool. And have presented this tool in multiple places, but they were kind enough to make the slides available for my talk today. So before we go forward, I just wanted to give you a little overview of what the talk is going to look like. I'll spend a few minutes on the background to discuss an overview of the approach and key methods issues, discuss the domains of the tool, and that's about 20 or 25 slides or so. And then I'll ask you to open up the PDF that you've been sent earlier and then walk you through the tool. And the reason for that is because the tool is really quite complex and really requires, I think, just a walkthrough to be able to understand it. And then we'll do some concluding remarks and hopefully have a little bit of time for questions. So to move on to the background, the reason for this review
Meera, I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you have your presentation open, because we can't see? Oh yeah, no, perfectly fine. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So you're able to see it now, Julia?
Yes. Thank you.
So the need for a tool, the reason why the Cochrane collaboration decided to invest in this was because, as you know, they have a tool for evaluating the risk of bias of trials, and it's very well accepted, probably the most commonly used tool globally. And increasingly, we were finding the need to include studies of non-randomized interventions, and that's a relatively new trend. And so the existing tools weren't quite meeting the needs of the Cochrane collaboration. Some of the principles that they espouse, especially around the use of risk bias concepts rather than policy, the existing tools didn't quite meet all of those. And so the Cochrane Methods Innovation Fund provided an opportunity to work on this new tool, and it's led by the bias methods group, the non-randomized studies methods group. Now, I wasn't involved in the development of the tools from the beginning. Nancy Berkman and I served as workgroup members. We also did some cognitive testing for the tools, but our involvement was much later. This began, I think, the idea began back in 2011, and it was released at the last colloquium in 2014, September. So it's been about 3 years in the making. And this is version 1.0. You have the website there. I've also sent you the PDF. But undoubtedly, as it's pushed into practice, there will be more changes. So stay tuned. So a few words about the scope of this tool. It's concerned with evaluating the risk of bias in studies of non-randomized interventions that look at health effects of 2 or more interventions. So it's interested in quantitative studies looking at estimate of harms or benefits. You know, so it's there's a couple of things that are important to note here. It's really focused on quantitative studies, and it's really looking at the effects. So it's looking at a causal relationship, a purported causal relationship between the intervention and the outcome. The kinds of designs it covers include observational designs, case control, time series, before and after, natural experiments, basically anything, any experimental or observational design that uses an allocation scheme other than randomization. So moving on to an overview of the approach and key methods issues. So the approach to conducting a risk of bias assessment for non-randomized studies of interventions is in some ways similar to what we've always done in the past, and then in some ways is quite a remarkable departure from what we've done. So certainly the piece that will seem most familiar is, of course, you need to plan for all of this ahead in the protocol, and that's something we've been doing. Beyond that, steps 2 and 3 are where the departure begins. So the first and the core aspect of this is to try and identify what a target randomized trial is for the review as a whole, and then for each study that you're looking at. And I'll tell you a little bit about that as we get there. And the second thing you need to do is identify what the effect of interest is. And neither of these is a task that we've done for reviewing risk of bias of observational studies so far. After you've done that at the protocol level, and then you move on to understanding what the overall confounders or co-interventions might be. That's what's covered under preliminary considerations. Then you move on to filling out the actual form on each outcome. And then, again, this next two steps are a departure from what we've done in the past. We certainly, what has become clear is this process is iterative. You may uncover confounders as you do this risk of bias assessment. That will require you to go back and reevaluate what you've done for the other outcomes. So at the outset, something to say is this tool is difficult. It's not meant for, there's nothing particularly easy about it, but the designers meant it that way because they feel that observational studies should be used with caution and with a lot of thought and require this degree of attention to detail. And then that the last step is also, I think, somewhat new in that what it recognizes is that you may want to consider the whole body of evidence in making a judgment. So this isn't just about grading the body of evidence, but also looking at where the sources of bias lie and in what direction they might be pulled or pushed by confounders, and to make a judgment overall. So I'll go over each of these steps in some detail. The first of these is about a target randomized trial. So it's really important to understand this because this forms the core, the crux of this particular instrument. The idea is that when you're evaluating the risk of bias, you're really considering each non-randomized intervention as an attempt to emulate a hypothetical randomized trial. So the idea here is, well, if you really want to address issues of bias that are unique to observational studies or non-randomized studies, you have to look at a randomized study. A randomized study addresses the core issues around confounding and selection bias that a non-randomized study may not be able to. So what would be the ideal, the target trial, and then what you look at is in what ways does the actual study that you're looking at fall short, or where do the sources of bias then creep in that might make the estimate biased. So that target trial doesn't have to be feasible, doesn't have to be ethical. It just needs to be, in an ideal situation, what would the target trial be? So you have, at the PICO level, you have to specify that to match the PICO of interest for the review in question. But that may not be enough, because certainly at the review level, you may specify what the PICO should be and what the target trial should be. But when you come to a specific study, it may be that something about the design of that study requires you to re-specify it for that study. So as I said, the core idea is you're evaluating the risk of bias against a standard. It's not, I think what used to be done in the past was everything was graded on its own merits. People would say, well, a cohort study can never be the same as a trial. We're going to grade it on its own merits. But here, what is core and different about this instrument is you're saying every study should be compared against a target trial. The second piece of it is to identify, and this is again a unique aspect and new addition that this tool is bringing, which is that we need to specify very early on what comparison we're interested in. So the target comparison could be either the effect of assignment to interventions at baseline, or it could be the effect of receiving the interventions. And the distinction here is if you're interested in, say, the effect of assignment, it may be that you're looking at a health policy question where you're looking at the effect of having offered the intervention. So an example is screening. Should you offer screening or should you not offer screening? And some of us were involved in a systematic review on medication therapy management. The question is, should the insurer offer medication therapy management or not? When you are considering the effect of the intervention from the perspective of the patient, you might be looking not at offering the intervention, but actually receiving it. So in that case, the specified intervention effect would be that of receiving the intervention as specified in the protocol. So did you get it or did you not get it? Not were you offered it or were you not offered it? And this distinction is really important because it influences the way you would look at departures from intended interventions, the performance biases. So I'm now going to move on to the types of biases addressed by the tool. And I'll spend more time on the first two because those are the ones that are truly most problematic for non-randomized studies. So it covers 7 domains, and we'll go over each of these. So the first of these is bias due to confounding. Now, what's interesting about this is, in the Cochrane risk of bias tool, it was called selection bias, and what they've attempted to do in laying out all of this is to try and make this distinct. So to try and correct the error from earlier, make sure that when we're talking about confounding, we're really focusing on confounding, teasing apart selection bias and pulling it into a different category. So bias due to confounding is what's otherwise known as allocation bias or case mix bias, channeling bias. And then there's a separate section that deals with selection of participants into the study. So this is what is in the rest of the EPI, I think commonly used in terms of observational studies. And it covers inception bias, lead time bias, and immortal time bias. A third source of bias that this tool looks at is bias in the measurement of intervention, so misclassification, information recall, measurement, or observer bias. Then the next 4 sources of bias, so there's departure from intended intervention, so performance bias, which we've talked about briefly, bias due to missing data, attrition bias, as it was commonly referred to in the previous instrument, the Cochrane risk of bias instrument. Bias in the measurement of outcomes, so detection bias, again, recall bias, information bias, misclassification bias, and observer bias. And then finally, the bias in the selection of reported results, so outcome or analysis reporting bias. So what's interesting about these 4 sources of bias is the first 3, bias due to confounding, bias in selection of participants into the study, and bias in the measurement of interventions occurs before, in the case of the first 2, or at the intervention. And those are the ones that are really distinct because they have to do with design and implementation of the design itself that are distinctly different in non-randomized studies than they are at trials. The next 4 occur after intervention, so bias due to departure from performance bias, attrition bias, measurement bias, and selective outcome reporting bias. Those all occur post-intervention. And so generally speaking, the considerations for non-randomized interventions and randomized interventions will be fairly similar. And in fact, I think Cochrane is intending to revise the current risk of bias tool to capture some of the thinking that's gone into the development of the last 4. So I'm going to move on to confounding. Did someone have questions? Should I just carry on? No? So I'm going to move on to and spend a little bit of time on the first 2, confounding and selective selection bias, just because those are particularly difficult constructs and cover a lot of new ground that we haven't explored in previous tools that look at risk of bias. So confounding, as many of you know, is a pre-intervention prognostic factor, and it predicts whether, and so that's C in this diagram, it predicts whether the individual receives one or the other intervention of interest, T, but it also predicts the outcome, D. So in this particular instrument, there are several sources of confounding or types of confounding domains that are covered. So in a large, well-constructed RCT, you can have causal inference because, the confounder does not predict the treatment. Assigned randomly, there is no arrow running from C to T, and so you don't have to worry about confounding. So it definitely, one of the things that this instrument worries about is whether or not confounders are measured, but it also worries about, it asks questions about whether or not there's over-adjustment for confounders. So, you certainly don't want to leave confounders unmeasured, but you don't want to over-adjust, say, for instance, by accounting for confounders that lie on the causal pathway from the treatment assignment to the outcome between T and D. You also don't want to condition on common effects of the treatment and the outcome. So the instrument asks questions about that as well. And then the third area of confounding that the instrument looks at is time-varying confounding, and we'll go over that in some detail as well. So there are some core principles that the instrument relies on, and this is because confounding is such a big portion of the instrument, it influences the way it should be applied. And the first principle is you really need subject matter experts. They should be included on the team in writing the protocol, in designing the review, and in conducting it. And the reason for it is because confounding is, there's multiple layers to its consideration. So the first point at which you consider confounding is when you're thinking about it at the protocol level. So you want to think about confounding domains that might be specific to the entire review. Then there's confounding domains that might be specific to the particular study you're looking at. Right? And then there's the issue of inappropriate controls for confounding. Then you need to also understand what types of analysis may be appropriate for each clinical area that you're looking at. And these might include stratification, regression, propensity score matching, standardization, inverse probability weighting. But all of these, when you're thinking about confounding, you can give studies a pass for having appropriately adjusted for confounding or for not having inappropriately controlled for confounding, only if there is no unmeasured or residual confounding. So you have to have some degree of confidence that they've addressed confounding. If you feel like the studies have ignored confounding, then none of these fixes will help. So the other piece of it, as I said, was time-varying confounding. And this has become an increasingly important issue for large epi databases. So if, for instance, you're looking at treatment as assigned, people enter the intervention, they're assigned treatment A versus treatment B. They may switch thereafter, but you're only looking at the outcomes that follow treatment A and treatment B, no problem, no time-varying confounding. But often in large epi databases, you're looking at people who may transition, switch from one intervention to another, and you're looking at outcomes that follow. So it might be, individual one is on treatment A, and then you record the outcome. Then after some time, they switch to treatment B, and you record the outcome. Because another problem with comparing treatment A and treatment B is that there might be prognostic factors that predict the switching from A to B. And if you don't account for it, then you have a biased result. So as long as prognostic factors predict these switches, there's a risk of time-varying confounding. There's an example here of how that works. So that's the third issue around confounding that this instrument takes into account. And one note of caution is that really, because the methods around time-varying confounding are so complex, you really need, in addition to a methods expert, you need specialist statisticians. So I'll move on to selection bias. The selection bias is the other piece of it that really requires, is distinctly different between trials and non-randomized studies, and the instrument pays quite a lot of attention to it. So selection bias, again, this instrument considers multiple sources of selection bias. It considers selection bias when some eligible participants are excluded, or when some initial follow-up time is excluded. So what ends up happening as a result is that the association you see between the intervention and the outcome is different than what it would have been in the target trial. So you see where the target trial comes back into play. And it's different from confounding. So this is really focusing on biases that are internal to the study. So, and there's also, I should have said in the beginning as well, that this instrument applies to multiple designs of non-randomized studies, but for case control studies, because the issues are fairly unique, the instrument pulls out those questions and puts it in as an addendum all the way in the back of the PDF that you have in your hand. So regarding selection bias, the first source of selection bias, bias due to selection of participants. So you can expect that to occur when some subset of the population that should have been included is excluded. So an example of that, and we're actually doing a systematic review on this very topic, folic acid supplementation and the risk of neural tube defects. Cohort studies that look at the exposure, which is folic acid supplementation, and then the outcome, neural tube defects, but only look at live births, have failed to account for the results from either therapeutic abortions or stillbirths. In those populations, it's possible that both the neural tube defect and the folic acid supplementation could have increased the rate of stillbirths and therapeutic abortions. So the association that you see between folic acid supplementation and the rate of neural tube defects in live-born babies is biased. So that's something to think about. You know, is there a bias from the selection of participants? And the second source of bias in selection is whether you've selected a certain piece of follow-up. And the most common version of this is when you're thinking about prevalent users. So you may have a group of prevalent users, and then you have a group of non-users. You start the clock at the same time for both of them. But what you've not accounted for is that there's a period of exposure that you're not aware of, where an outcome could have happened. So if you look at what's actually happening is that you've got a gap. See where these two blue lines, there's a bit of white bar where there's a lead time where you didn't make an observation. That's when the intervention actually started for the prevalent users. And in that time, an outcome could have occurred which you didn't see. And so that's a potential for, it leads to a potential for selection bias. And then these two sources of bias, the confounding and selection bias, occur before the intervention often. And then at the intervention, there's measurement bias due to measurement of interventions. Now in trials, it's the intervention's randomized. It's pretty clear what the intervention is, generally speaking. You know what you got or what you didn't get. But in non-randomized studies, it may not be as clear. And some of the issues might have to do with selective recall or case finding. So you might search harder to find out whether an individual got an intervention or not. Sometimes in retrospective studies, it's not clearly marked whether a person got an intervention or not. So the issues can be much more significant in identifying measurement of interventions for a non-randomized study than for a trial. So moving on to post-intervention bias domains. As you recall, these are all the ones that are actually fairly similar between trials and observational studies. But we'll go over each one, and you can see where you might have to, the sorts of things that you might have to pay more attention to because it's a non-randomized study. So for biases from intended interventions, one of the reasons why it might be, although the effect of a bias, a departure from intended interventions will be similar for trials and non-randomized studies, you might have more of a problem around this issue for non-randomized studies because, generally speaking, the mechanism that serves to protect against it, which is blinding of participants and trial personnel, doesn't occur as often in non-randomized studies. And then the issue around bias due to missing data. Again, the effect of missing data is going to be the same for trials and for observational studies. But it's possible that observational studies, because in some cases, particularly when you're not collecting the data prospectively, you might have missing data on the intervention or confounders, and that might exacerbate the issue of missing data. Other post-intervention domains that that this instrument covers includes measurement of outcomes. And in both cases, you could blind observers, and that would address the issue of bias in measurement of outcomes. The last issue that the tool considers is bias in selection of the reported results. Again, similar for both trials and observational studies or non-randomized studies. What trials do have that serves as a form of protection is that they have protocols. Now, non-randomized studies in some cases, but certainly in the majority of cases will not have a protocol, and so you might have more pronounced issues of selection bias. So those are all the domains, and that's the rationale for including them. I'm just going to go over the summary for each, what exactly within each domain, what issues are being addressed. So bias due to confounding. So A, is confounding likely or not? Then B, how good was the adjustment? Was it over-adjusted? And is there time-varying confounding? Issues that we just talked about. Bias in selection of participants into the study. So does the follow-up and the start of the intervention coincide? And were the participants selected based on the effects of the intervention and the outcome, or was it independent of that? So, and then for case control studies, there's a more specific, narrow question asking, did the controls and cases come from the same population? Bias in measurement of outcomes asks, was the intervention well defined? Did you collect information on the intervention status at the time of the intervention itself? Were you aware of the outcome when measuring the intervention? Bias due to departure from intended interventions covers co-interventions, intervention switches, fidelity, and statistical adjustment for co-interventions. Bias due to missing data covers completeness of data, imbalance, and reasons for missing data, completeness of the intervention data, other missing data, and statistical methods used to cover missing data. Bias in measurement of outcomes asks, was the outcome measurement objective? Were you aware of it when you measured it? And then are there any systematic errors in measuring it? Bias in selective outcome reporting covers multiple time points, multiple outcomes, multiple analyses, and then reporting on a subset of participants. So the takeaway from this is, this is all of the domains squeezed into one slide, but it's a long tool. It covers a lot of ground. So what's not covered by the tool, right? So remember the core aspect of this, which is that you're really comparing the non-randomized intervention to a target trial. And that's where you're evaluating the risk of bias. Well, it may be that the target trial isn't that applicable to your research question. Well, that's not covered by this tool. That's really a question of applicability, and it's treated as a source of heterogeneity in the tool. The other thing that this tool does not deal with is imprecision. So it doesn't ask questions about failure to account for correlation due to clustering or matching. It doesn't ask any of those questions. It really focuses just on internal validity and risk of bias. So I'm going to, having done an overview of the tool, I'd like to walk you through the tool. So I'm assuming everybody has the tool handy. Julia, is that all right?
Yes, we have it in front of us.
Okay, and so, if you printed it out, you'll know it's a lot of pages, 56 pages to be exact. So pages 1 through 45, sorry, 44. So the first 44 pages really describe each of these domains that I went through at super high speed. It describes each of them in detail. It gives examples. It explains what kinds of questions are being asked, why, how to evaluate it, and then it moves on to give you a way to evaluate the overall risk bias. And then from page 45 onward is the actual instrument. So this is a lot. I mean, it takes a lot of time to become familiar with it. So I'll try and give you an introduction to it, but I will warn you that it's going to take more than 10 minutes worth of overview. So let me break it down into pieces. This instrument requires use at multiple stages. The first stage is at the protocol stage itself. And we talked about this earlier. So you want to start by specifying the research question and defining a generic target randomized trial. And then you want to say what the nature of the target comparison is overall. Then you want to list all the confounding domains that you think are relevant to all or most of the studies. Then you want to list all of the co-interventions that are relevant to the intervention groups and could influence the study outcomes. So these 4 tasks occur at the protocol stage. Right? And to give you a sense of where that is, if you go to the instrument, that's on page 45. Right? So you'll see where there's a place for you. Items 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, and 6.4. Ask these questions at the protocol stage. If you want guidance on how to fill out these pieces, it's back in pages 1 through 45. So now you've gotten what you needed to, you've recorded what you needed to for the protocol. The next stage is to start recording information for each study. So if you move on to pages 46 and 47, it asks, what is the target trial that's specific to the study? Now, it may be that what you define in the protocol fully applies, in which case you check that box and you move on. But if it turns out that that target trial really doesn't apply to the study in question, you will have to redefine the target trial for that question. Then you need to specify what outcome you're looking at. Generally speaking, you have to say, is it a benefit or a harm? So specify what the outcome is, and then specify the effect of interest. So are you interested in initiating the intervention or initiating and adhering to the intervention? So is it a intention to treat analysis you're interested in or a per protocol analysis? And then you have to get down to the specific result being assessed. So exactly what outcome are you looking at? Question 7.5 asks you to lay out what the preliminary confounders might be, in addition to the confounders that you've already identified at the protocol stage. What are the confounders that are specific to the study? And then if you flip to the next page, page 48, I'm sorry, 49. I'll go over 48 in a minute. Page 49, it asks you to lay out what the co-interventions are. You actually have to fill out a fair bit more information on it, and I'll go over it in the next 2 tables. But it's a bit more detailed than I wanted to do just now. So we'll move to the outcome level consideration of bias just now. So you fill out a fair bit of information at the protocol stage, then a fair bit of information that's specific to each study, and then you get to the outcome level assessment within each bias domain. So a quick overview of what that entails. There are signaling questions, just like quarters do. So questions that are relying on factual information. And if you consider that something has a serious risk of bias, you need to enter in free text descriptions of what you're finding and use that free text information and the signaling questions to arrive at a risk of bias judgment for each domain. And then, I don't know if you recall, but way in the beginning I had said one of the things that this instrument does that's different is requires you to triangulate. So go back and consider the entire evidence base. So in order to do that, one of the tasks is to judge the direction of bias. Now, it's an optional activity because I think the designers understood that this was really hard to do. But the theory behind it is if you're finding that there's confounder A which pushes the likely direction of bias in one direction and confounder B that pushes it in the opposite direction, when you consider the entire body of evidence, it may be that you're finding consistent results despite these confounders, and you can take away something from it. Whereas otherwise, in earlier times, we would have said, well, there's a confounder, they haven't adjusted for it entirely, or it's clear that it's influencing the direction of the effect. And so we can't believe any of it. This attempt to identify the direction of bias is a way to try and extract more information from what might be potentially biased sources. Finally, all of this feeds into grade. So, we talked about the first 2 things. I won't go over it. So slide 31 really just describes what we did on pages 46 and 47. I'm sorry, 45 on page 45. So specify a generic randomized target trial, specify the target comparison, list the domains that are relevant to the study, and list to the review, and the co-interventions, and all those go into the protocol. Then, as I said on pages 46 and 47, the walkthrough for each study, a target trial, the specific outcomes, the effective interest, the specific results, and then confounders and co-interventions. So now I'll move to those boxes that I had talked about. When you lay out the confounders and co-interventions, let's start with the confounder box. So this, on the PDF, that's page 48, it asks you to lay out the confounding domain, asks you to make a judgment. Is this domain critically important? And the reason for this is there's going to be lots of confounders in a study that may not matter very much. And should you invest this kind of effort in evaluating the risk of confounding from confounding domains that are largely unimportant? And this is why you need a subject matter expert who can say, well, this confounding domain is critical, and it would really lead to a clinically important change in the estimate of the effect. So you don't need to do this exercise if you don't think the intervention, your judgment is that this isn't a critically important confounder. Then you write down what the actual variable was that measured it. Now, it may be that overall you consider that this variable, this confounding domain, is critically important for the entire review. But in this particular study that you're looking at, the authors have done such a good job of dealing with it through design or some other way that they've demonstrated it wasn't really necessary for us to control for the variable. So, for instance, is confounding from a particular, including a particular, say, age or something like that. But then they designed it so that they're only looking at a subgroup, and their results are only applicable to the subgroup. They've demonstrated that it's not necessary to control for that variable. Then if, in fact, it is necessary to control for the variable, you ask, well, did they measure that domain validly and reliably? And is it likely that this is the optional domain about direction of bias, is it likely to push the effect up or down? And you fill out the tables for basically on a study-by-study basis. Then you need to do something similar for co-interventions. You need to ask, what are the critically important co-interventions in the context of the entire review, and then in the context of the specific study that would lead to a clinically important change in the estimate of effect. Again, the idea is not to list every potential co-intervention, only those that are likely to push the estimate of effect in a clinically important direction. Again, you need subject matter experts to make these decisions. The rest of the table looks fairly similar to the confounders table. So is it critically important? If yes, did they demonstrate that it wasn't necessary to control for it, in which case you're done? If no, did they measure it validly and reliably? And then is it likely to have influenced the outcomes favorably for either the experimental group or the control group? And that's, again, to take a step back at the end of the review and figure out, does this mean anything? Now, this is what, once you've done all this, these are the actual questions. The signaling questions, the open-ended text questions, the risk of bias questions for each domain, and then the overall risk of bias. So 7 domains. So you see the question here, signaling questions. Did the study authors use an appropriate analysis? And these are meant to be factual. Then a free text description. Then you come up with a risk of bias judgment. Now, in the risk of bias judgment, this is the part that, well, there's probably multiple parts of this tool that are confusing, but when you get to the tool on page 50 starts, the actual tool for each outcome starts on page 50. You can fill out most of it from page 50 onward, but in order to actually come up with a risk of bias judgment, say, for instance, risk of bias for confounding. So that's on page 51, at the, close to the bottom of the first very long row. In order to find the guidance for it, you have to flip back to pages 4 through 44. And there is a table that's really specific to risk of bias judgment for confounding. So that particular table is back on page, sorry, I have to look for it. So it's on page 20. So it tells you when do you expect to have a low risk of bias, when do you have to expect to have a moderate risk of bias, when do you have a serious critical or critical risk of bias, or when can you just say there's no information. Once you've come up with these risk of bias judgments for each domain, and you've said whether you can predict the direction of bias, then you have to come up with an overall risk of bias judgment. And here again, there's things that have departed from the instrument in the past. I'm going to skip all this and say, generally speaking, the risk of bias for the overall outcome across all these domains will correspond to the lowest score you've gotten. So that's similar to grade, if you recall. So if you've gotten a serious or a critical risk of bias in one domain and everything else is higher, well, it doesn't matter, because then the whole outcome is at a, that effect is at a serious risk of bias. One thing to note, another sort of overall takeaway from this instrument, is that because it's very difficult for a non-randomized study of interventions to completely control for confounding, chances are it will have either a moderate or a higher risk of bias from confounding. So using this instrument, you're not going to be able to come to a low risk of bias for a non-randomized study, generally speaking. So very few will be assessed at low risk of bias, and that's intentional. The free text descriptions are, they provide support for answers to signaling questions, risk of bias judgment, and they must be provided when you say no or probably no, or when risk of bias judgments are serious and critical. So I talked a bit about predicting the direction of effect. We don't know what the risk of bias is, and I explained why we want to get it, but I think the reality is that it's been hard to implement in practice. The overall risk of bias judgment merits a little bit of time. So as I said, the overall risk of bias across all domains equates the lowest risk of bias, the most serious risk of bias that you have for any one domain. So the worst risk of bias judgment across domains carries forward to the overall risk of bias. And this is different from the risk of bias tool, where there wasn't an overall judgment, and you sort of looked at all the stop sign lights, and I guess came to some sort of overall sense in your head. Now you can, so if you have a serious in one domain, that means serious overall, and critical means critical overall. But it doesn't mean that if you have serious in multiple domains, that doesn't translate to critical overall. You might decide that all of these seriouses really add up to a critical, or several moderates really add up to a serious overall. So you can go downward. You can't go up, but you can go down. So you might have, this is an example of how you might have outcome-specific assessments, where you can see for mortality, there's low risk of bias for several things, moderate for some, but then there's one serious, and so it becomes serious. And I won't go through all of them, but you get the point. So in conclusion, it's based on extensive and careful consideration of the domain's bias. It requires an explicit comparison with the target trial. For pre-intervention and at-intervention bias categories, the bias domains are quite different from for non-randomized studies than for randomized studies. For post-intervention bias domains, they're very similar to randomized trials, but generally have additional issues that are higher risk of bias. And it requires both content and methodological expertise. It needs subject matter expertise, and it needs specialist statistician expertise in some cases. You have the website, and I'm going to stop now and see if this involved a cast of thousands. This just tells you who was involved. I'm going to stop and ask if you have questions.
Thank you for your presentation. Are there any questions?
Meera, this is Dan. Great presentation. That was really helpful and kind of fun to walk through the details of the tool. Has there been any assessment that you know of the usefulness or the time that it takes to complete the tool?